Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today, we're going to talk about how to make trees fight climate change. Now, that title is something of a misnomer. We can't make a tree do anything, but we can make a tree. We can plant it and watch it grow. And trees automatically fight climate change. So there you go. Trees are made out of cellulose, and cellulose, well, it is carbon. There are literally 6 atoms of carbon in every molecule of cellulose. And all that carbon going into building that tree comes out of the air. So we can make a tree, and that tree will fight climate change for us. And what could be better? I mean, I love trees. I love looking at them. I love climbing them. I love the way they smell, and I love the fruit and nuts they gift us with. And what can be easier than planting a tree? It's certainly easier than mowing grass. And the more trees you have around your house, the cooler and cleaner your air will be. So plant a tree or plant a forest. Teams in India and other places around the world are growing home forests with as many as 300 trees in the area of 6 parking spaces. That's what 300 trees growing in around 900 square feet. That's a full-on forest in your backyard. That's an ecosystem. So plant a home forest. We're joined today on Zoom by Ryan Watson, National Orchard Operations and Education Manager for the Giving Grove. Ryan has a passion for teaching people about the joys of caring for fruit trees. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, Bob. Thanks so much for having me.
Meg Ryan is the executive director of the Tree Foundation. Meg is a forest explorer, a climber, conservation biologist, a mom, disruptor, and author. She is the world's first global arbornaut, having pioneered methods to study the treetops and researched in over 40 countries. Her newest project, Mission Green, aims to offset climate change and employ indigenous women by building canopy walkways for conservation and ecotourism. Dr. Lohman has a Bachelor of Arts in Biology from Williams College, a Master of Science in Ecology from Aberdeen University, and a PhD in Botany from Sydney University. Meg is a champion for saving big trees, and National Geographic has labeled her the real-life Lorax. Hi, Meg.
Hey, nice to be here. Thank you, Bob.
Well, before we get started talking about trees, I'd really like to know more about both of you. Meg, do your friends actually call you Canopy Meg?
They actually do. I got that nickname from kids, however, who used to write to me all the time, Dear Canopy Meg.
That is so cool. How do you feel about being called Dr. Lohman?
Oh, you don't have to bother, but I guess if it's necessary, but I'm very happy with Canopy Meg.
The Wall Street Journal calls you the Einstein of the treetops, so there's also that. Seems like you have a lot of names. What was the path that led you to becoming the real life Lorax?
Gosh, I was a shy, geeky girl growing up in rural upstate New York, the kid that never spoke in class. And of course, in my generation, people said girls couldn't be scientists. So I collected a lot of things. I had bird nests under my bed and snake skins and dried wildflowers. And my poor mom had to put up with all that. But it was a passion. And I just eventually kept studying biology and studying trees. And lo and behold, I started to climb them because, believe it or not, most foresters only study about 5% of the tree, which is the base. And when I found out that about half of the creatures on this planet live at the top, it meant that I needed to figure out ways to become an arbornaut, which is the technical word for treetop explorer.
That's very cool. Ryan, you started out studying political science and history, then became a paralegal with the intention of attending law school. How did you get from there to being an urban farmer?
Oh, well, uh, yeah, what a pathway it's been. I would say probably to mirror some of the things that Meg has said. I always felt a love for being in trees. There's a picture of me at 10 years old with a broken arm at a birthday party in a tree. So I think one of those things that Meg and I kind of share in common is feeling at home amongst the trees, and climbing was just always such a powerful thing for me. But I think it was really a love of nature and the transformative power of growing food for yourself. I had always grown vegetables in pots in a balcony. I grew up in Los Angeles in an apartment building. But as soon as I got a space in a community garden, I really found my comfort zone. And the contrast of working in an office all day to spending time with your hands in the soil, being able to engage with the community around you was just such a powerful, transformative thing. And with a background in social activism and political organization, I sort of realized that everyone eats every day. There are political choices that are associated with how we eat and what we eat, and it just happened to be a serendipitous thing. I started working in Brooklyn, got involved in urban farming at the time, transforming vacant lots into community green spaces, and man, that was just such a powerful thing. And then serendipitously, a few years later, I ended up moving to the Catskill Mountains, which share the same geographic latitude space as the Tian Shan Mountains in Kazakhstan, where the wild apple comes from. And that year in 2015 was the biggest wild apple year in a generation. And that was it. I was hooked, and been planting apples ever since, and now working with the Giving Grove, have the pleasure to help other people learn from the mistakes that we made along the way.
Tell us about the North Brooklyn farm. That was kind of a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really transformative point in my life. So I had come with a background in political science and uh, working at a law firm. And at the end of the day, I would walk around the city and I would see these vacant lots and just think about the potential that there was to transform the community. I'd had those experiences myself and seen how they had changed my perspective on food and just my connectivity to the natural world around me. And again, just so fortunate to be at a time a developer had just purchased the Domino Sugar Factory, which had been closed to the public for 150 years. They put out a request for proposals to use the former parking lot space as a community project while the construction permits were being issued. And what started as a temporary 1-year lease became 7 seasons operating an urban farm and public green space. We hosted dinners, we had events, we did hundreds of thousands of visitors over our time, and that sort of launched my career in agriculture.
It's pretty amazing. So let's get to trees then. How do trees improve the environment and ecosystems in general? Ryan, you want to start?
Well, I'd be happy to start, but I'd actually be curious to sort of hear kind of Meg's perspective on that question.
Well, that's the big trees, Meg. What's unique about the big trees? What are they doing for the environment?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just gave 2 fifth-grade talks this morning on Zoom, and the kids all wanted to know, what do trees do? It's so great to think that elementary school kids are really interested in trees, but big trees really are like huge condominiums in the sky. When you think about it, they house millions of creatures. Scientifically, we now know that 80% of species on the land part of our planet live in the top of a tree. So it basically means every time you save a big tree or cultivate one, you're actually growing all kinds of cool creatures up there. And we also know that trees have been responsible for a majority of our medicines, the original chemicals for many medical research and solutions to illness have come from those chemicals in trees. And trees, of course, provide oxygen. I don't know if you want my 2-hour lecture, but they provide energy from sunlight. They provide food. My favorite food in the world, which is chocolate, comes from a tree. And of course, we have those more ordinary things like timber and all sorts of wonderful things like spiritual importance. I was just telling the 5th graders this morning that 6 billion people use trees for spiritual and religious purposes in India and Africa. And we sometimes forget about that in North America, that a sacred tree in every village in India, for example, is a really critical part of their culture. So I think it's just fabulous that everybody starts to appreciate it's really $1 million machine sitting along the street median or along the backyard, and you don't even have to pay it, or you usually don't even have to repair its parts. Just give it some attention and space, and it will do wonderful things for you.
And I think it's great to hear about the work that Meg is doing, because I think that we're both tackling a lot of the same tactics from different ends of the spectrum. So Meg is working with these large trees that are having tremendous impact on carbon sequestration, on providing additional oxygen and benefits. And with our community orchard program, we're working in an urban environment, in a much smaller spaces, with trees that are starting out smaller, but trying to multiply the impact of the trees. Our tagline is Little Orchards, Big Impact. So on average, we have about 15 trees per orchard. Our current count is just over 650 orchards in 16 cities across the country. And the benefits that we see from those trees are very varied. From on the environmental side, we have carbon sequestration. We're working on absorbing that urban runoff, so managing stormwater systems. As well, they're removing pollutants from the air. So we have a lot of environmental pollutants from factories and cars, and we're also getting an effect of cooling in urban environments as well, which has an impact on the heating and cooling systems that we need to use, and our impact on the climate in terms of our energy use. So those things directly, and then in terms of the impact that we see on our human communities, is really, really diverse and has a lot of really tangible benefits to them.
What about the relationship between the plants, the soil, fungi, that kind of thing? What's happening in the ground with your orchards?
Absolutely. And this is something that I'm really, really keen on, as we approach our management of the orchards from a holistic, an organic and regenerative standpoint. So one of the things that I really like to focus on in our education is that the best way to care for the trees is to care for the soil underneath them, and to care for the plants that are helping to facilitate those interactions. So working with understory plantings to improve soil fertility, that increased organic matter that grows underneath the trees improves the ability of the trees to sequester carbon. One of the really principal relationships that I like to highlight for folks is the interaction with trees with mycorrhizae, because we really are working in conjunction with the fungi networks that are underneath these trees. The mycorrhizae system, which is the root, essentially when you translate from Greek, is the mushroom root. And this root system plays, this mushroom mycorrhizae network plays a role in extending the root system of the trees. So this enables the trees to absorb more nutrients, and we're talking about an order from like 40 to 100 times expansion of that root system. So when we're working with providing mulch and other beneficial elements for soil fertility, that's also increasing that mycorrhizae network, which is really increasing the benefits that we see with the environment as well.
As far as oh, sorry, shall I
No,
go?
go ahead.
I
Yes,
was just
please.
going to jump in, because even though I love the treetops, I was actually one of the first researchers to study mycorrhizal relationships in natural forests, and this was back in the 1980s. we were puzzled because most people think of the tropical rainforest as a place full of thousands of different species of trees, but in actual fact, there are plenty of stands that are only one species. The Antarctic beach in Australia or the Mora forests in Trinidad. It's really interesting when you look around and see all these single dominant stands of trees, and we tracked it down to being the mycorrhizal advantage that some of these trees, eucalypts are similar in Australia, of course, have this special relationship, and it does give the tree a competitive advantage, which also means if you clear an area and then you plant later something else, or you try to replant trees, a lot of times people don't have much success because they haven't really reseeded or respored, I guess you could say, the mycorrhizal relationship that some of the trees need to be successful. So it's a pretty amazing thing. And similarly, trees communicate at the top. The leaves send out chemicals that help prevent insect attack, and they talk to each other in many different ways, top to bottom. So I think there's a lot of elements of trees we still don't know too much about, even though we depend upon them.
And this
So
was a
tell us
really,
more.
oh, excuse me.
Oh, no, go ahead.
This was just a really fascinating thing for me, and I'm very grateful for your research on these relationships because uh, working with orchards in a holistic sense, Michael Phillips, who's kind of the who we turn to as one of the key thinkers in holistic orchard management, says you, that the orchard spaces should be trees are going to perform best in a forest edge ecology. And before he passed away, his book Mycorrhizae Planet really highlighted these relationships for me in a way that completely changed the way that we are managing our trees here at our farm in New York. This idea that trees perform best in fungal dominant soils. In order to have a fungally dominant soil, you really need to cover the soil. You really need to have high levels of moisture. But traditionally, we grow orchards in open meadow spaces with grass. And that does not create that relationship. So how can we make those adaptation changes to really start to give the trees what they want?
I wanted to hear more about the canopy. I mean, obviously the fungal, the roots, and all that kind of stuff. Very interesting, very important. Opposite side of that is the canopy. I mean, what makes that so special and important? Okay.
Well, I call the canopy the eighth continent because it truly is an unexplored piece of the planet. And I kind of laughed because it was 1979 when my advisor said, well, if you want to study leaves, Margaret, you'll have to get to the top of the tree. And I was horrified. I wanted to hire and train a monkey. I thought that would be fantastic, just to send some little primate up there to collect my leaves, and I could be lying in a hammock on the forest floor. But my advisor said, no, I think you'll have to do something directly. And I welded my first slingshot out of a piece of metal because slingshots were illegal in Australia. And I sewed a harness out of old seatbelt webbing, and up I went. And as I mentioned before, so many things were up there. It's just extraordinary. And when you really do think about millions of leaves populating a big kapok tree or a giant Meranti tree in Malaysia, A, you get great oxygen, but B, you get all these things wanting to live up there. And of course, trees can't run away from their enemies like animals can, so they have to develop all these amazing defenses and seasonal calendars of when they flower and when the pollinators might be there. And as far as the interactions that Ryan kind of deals with more directly as people and trees together, you end up with a lot of pollinators of people's gardens spending part of their life cycle in a tree, and you obviously end up with a lot of interesting conditions around those edges of forest stands that provide more water table and more humidity and more dappled shade and all kinds of conditions that might be helpful to the humans that are trying to make a living around the edges of forests or even within forests. So the canopy is really understudied. I hope any young people listening to us might say, maybe I could grow up and be an arbor nut, because we sure need more people to get up into those trees and discover this unexplored continent.
You mentioned building a slingshot. I assume you're shooting your rope up there over limbs, and then so you're hoisting yourself up.
That's a great, thanks for clarifying that. Yes, if you can believe it, that was my end solution without the monkey. I used the slingshot to put a fish line over a branch 50 to 75 feet high, and then I interfaced that with a piece of nylon blind cord, a mid-sized little rope, and that was strong enough to pull my climbing rope over. And I had borrowed some climbing ropes from the caving club at Sydney University. They were all guys, and they laughed their heads off. They couldn't believe I wanted to go up. They thought everything was down into a cave, that is. So we had some good jokes over the years about the value of climbing up or climbing down.
I had assumed it was for fending off the monkeys once you get up to the
There,
canopy.
occasionally, whenever I would eat my sandwich in the canopies of places like Panama and Central America, there were some awfully curious and hungry monkey tribes.
Hmm. Hmm. So let's look at, I want to talk about the trees and their benefits for climate change. I mean, obviously that's what we're focused on here. And I think we get different benefits from different areas. Ryan, start with you. How does planting trees in neighborhoods help fight climate change?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, we talked about these kind of immediate, direct, measurable impacts. Uh, Carbon sequestration, improvement of urban air, cooling of spaces, stormwater retention, supporting biodiversity. But then in terms of like the human impact as well, and the way that we sort of see these spaces become a space for people to connect with nature. And when people have connecting experiences with nature, they feel more a part of it. They're more likely to defend those spaces. And additionally, one of the things, and I think this is sort of where I see these overlaps with the work that Meg is doing as well, is we're working on educating the next generation about the changes that they can make in their lives to improve the environment and to fight climate change. And one of the best ways to fight climate change in an immediate impact is for someone to plant a tree. And so these community spaces offer that. And then they offer this intergenerational exchange, which is a very, very powerful, difficult to measure, but very, very powerful impact.
And so there's the impact, like say, plant a tree, the community spaces, or even your yard. I mean, I think the home forest, the home trees, that's something that's so simple to do. I'm not an expert. I mean, I dig the hole, put it in there, and then let it do its thing. And
Yeah.
it's just amazing. You come back 5, 6 years later, and here's a 40, 50-foot tree. All that carbon to build that tree coming out of the air.
And
Meg,
one
what?
of the things that's amazing is that we can fit these spaces in, people were like, I can't have an orchard. And like, you can fit a lot of trees into a small space. Um, One of our newest partners at Project Pando, who's a nonprofit in the North Carolina, Durham, Raleigh area. They have a program where they plant a pocket forest. So it's a very small area, and they're planting a huge density of native plants, supporting pollinators, supporting biodiversity, providing food, providing shade spaces for humans and animals alike. So really, there's a lot of potential in those spaces.
I've been speaking to that group in India. They're doing those pocket forests, as you call them, and like I say, they're the multi-layers. So you've got multiple strata and just so many trees in such a small space. Meg, how did the big trees? I mean, now we're talking about the rainforest, things like that. How did the big trees offset climate change?
So first of all, we have big trees here too. It doesn't need to be the rainforest. I
Of
think
course.
what's exciting about trees is that number one, to plant trees is actually a giant responsibility. A lot of people think you just pop something in the ground and up it grows, but it takes water, it takes maintenance, it takes pest removal. A good example is a country where I do a lot of work, Ethiopia, and I just love the native trees of Ethiopia. But in trying to farm Ethiopia, they cut down about 95% of the forests, and they sometimes grow back the wrong trees, which is a difficult thing. And the places where they've left the native trees, of course, have much more water table. So the women don't have to walk 5 miles to get water. They might only have to walk a half a mile, and they have their medicines, and their gardens are more lush because the pollinators come from those native forest canopies. So there's just so many reasons to save the big trees when we can, and plant trees where we've already cleared areas and we need to recover them, because the big trees, as I mentioned earlier, are like these fabulous machines that offset climate change while we sleep. So that they're fantastic in absorbing the carbon and storing it and cooling down the soil and the landscape and adding humidity to the atmosphere and keeping that water table more stable. So the end result in a area with forest and big trees is that you do get a more stable climate. You get fewer droughts and extreme heat, phases and things that some cities are facing after they've cut all their trees down. So saving big trees is just an easy way to offset climate change. Planting trees is a more difficult process because you do have to look after them, but fortunately it's still a good solution.
Yeah, I guess I've been lucky every time I've planted a tree, it just did its thing, because, I'm not a botanist or horticulturalist. I'm just
Oh,
gonna put it in there and it's either gonna grow or it's not.
well, one little thing on that note is in Ethiopia, where again I work a lot, the president declared a plant tree day. They had 352 million trees that were planted, and a year later, in that hot, arid environment, of course, that's already taken on some of the toll of climate change, they had less than 5% success with that fantastic number of seedlings. So you're lucky if you're in a climate area where you could grow your trees with a little less homework.
Yeah, exactly. It is the luck. Um, Focusing more on the big forest, not just trees, but the forest. Don't they have a disproportionate role in climate change? I keep reading that the Amazon, with all the deforestation and such, is nearing a point where it would collapse. And they talk about a river in the sky. I mean, the humidity from the Amazon that reaches all the way up to the American Midwest. And if we see that collapse there, it's going to change weather conditions in the Midwest. I mean, Meg, how much of that's
Absolutely.
true?
Huge, it's huge. And there are 3 large forest areas in the world in the tropical section: the Asian tropics, the Amazonian tropics, and then the African. And then, of course, we still have some temperate forests. Russia, Siberia is still quite an unusually dense area of temperate forests, but that's a whole different picture because they lose their foliage part of the year and their cold part of the year. So back to the tropics, the Amazon is the last largest section of forests. Unfortunately, Africa's been broken up and logged, and now it's fragmented, and the same thing is happening in Asia. And the scientists have predicted that exceeding 20% clearing the Amazon is called a tipping point, meaning that won't be recoverable, that the forest has so much extra heat and drying out around the edges because it's been fragmented that it won't be able to return to that amazing climate control that you just mentioned, where there's quite a huge amount of humidity and moisture and rainfall that are actually kind of siphoned through the trees. The trees are like a large sponge, and they do keep that cycle really, really healthy. And I always tell kids, if you cut a sponge up in 100 pieces, it dries out in about 10 minutes. But if you have a dripping wet sponge that's whole, it won't even be dry by morning. It'll keep all that moisture. And that's the same with the forest. If we fragment it and cut pieces away from other pieces, it becomes a much drier and more vulnerable situation. And when those things go, like the Amazon, it takes all those critters with it, you know, all the orchids and all the sloths and all the hundreds of millions of species of insects may not return. So we're looking at more than just the loss of trees in the Amazon. We're looking at the loss of a giant amount of Earth's creatures.
And I
You
think
listen,
this really helps to highlight some of kind of the importance of the work that Meg is doing and that we're doing with Giving Grove is like you ask yourself, well, how is it that my choices are going to impact the Amazon?
Oh, yeah.
And that is like a tremendous, like you have, it seems like maybe you don't, but if you're buying food that has palm oil in it and they're clear cutting forests to plant those palm plantations, that's having an impact, right? If you're buying uh, beef that's coming from an area that was clear cut in the Amazon to graze cattle, then that has an impact on climate change. And these are these ways in which we can make those choices. We can educate people to make better choices.
our consumption habits, they can save forests by not buying the products that are causing the deforestation.
Exactly.
Absolutely. There's so much connectivity between our Western consumerism and some of these forests that appear to be far away. And it's hard to educate people about that. I guess those lessons aren't really taught in business school as much as we scientists might wish they were. And so people need to know that, you know, you need to buy coffee grown in the shade of a rainforest, not coffee grown in a clear cut area, which actually doesn't even taste as good. So there are a lot of lessons that we need to learn in order to keep those forests and offset our climate change at the same time.
And this is a way in which there's really this great overlap because it's been what's beneficial for the tree ecosystem, for the larger natural ecosystem, those things are better for us as well. Um, that we've shown that the National Institute of Health has shown that since World War II, the amount of nutrients in the produce has gone down precipitously. So in order to get the amount of vitamin A from a red pepper that you did in 1940, you now have to eat something like 8 times that amount to get that same amount of nutrients. And there's some main reasons for that, and one of them is the soil fertility. And so the way that we're addressing these soil issues, which are beneficial for the trees, they're beneficial for climate change, they're also beneficial for ourselves because, you know, we're not going to get those nutrients if we're killing the soil off by practicing those clear cut. And that's why we say like focus on your understory, plant cover crops, do the things to really keep that soil covered. And that's the best way to care for your trees. It's the best way to care for our environment and to make those impacts on climate change.
And speaking of soil, what's really amazing is that most tropical regions have very poor soil. People are always so surprised that this giant forest grows there. So they cut it down and think, wow, I can grow my peppers or I can grow corn. But all the nutrition in most tropical areas is actually in what we call the above ground biomass, meaning the nutrients are up in the tree. So if you burn the trees or you clear cut the forest and just burn the waste, which so often happens, you end up taking thousands of years of nutrients and they're disappearing into the ocean or into the atmosphere. And quite honestly, we should probably all eat food from Minnesota and upstate New York because those glaciated soils are the richest soils to grow produce. And my state of Florida probably doesn't have nearly as good of soils because we never had glaciers. And in the tropics, it's even worse. So this is a huge problem, meaning we probably can't recreate many of those tropical rainforests. The notion of replanting a forest, I worked on a project, for example, where we were trying to ascertain the rate of recovery of seedlings in forests. And we had little seedlings, I'm holding my fingers about 2 inches apart, that were 75 years old. They didn't have enough nutrition to grow big. They didn't have the right light conditions. They certainly didn't have any of the biodiversity that used to to surround them. So we have a bottleneck, as we call it, where maybe it's not possible to restructure a tropical rainforest space because of the poor soils and the fact that the climate has changed so much once we clear it.
You're
Sorry
listening
about
to
the
the
gloom
Climate
and
Hour.
doom.
It's okay. It's reality. You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Meg Lohman and Ryan Watson about how to make trees fight climate change. Let's shift over to community a little bit. I know you kind of touched on that, Ryan, how orchards, caring for orchards, how they benefit the community in terms of human terms, interaction terms. Can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that really highlights this impact of orchards as a community space is this concept of the third space. Um, so a third space is considered to be your first space is your home, your second space is your place of work, and the third space are these sort of nebulous community spaces that can range from a variety of things. It could be your local bar, it could be a gym, it can be a community center, it can be your place of worship, it can be the forest in certain instances. Uh, and these spaces are really important. They create uh, an ability for community resilience. And I think when we talk about climate change, resilience is a common term, an important concept to highlight. And I'll share an example of community resilience in the wake of of a um, a environmental consequence um, of climate change. And one of those things is in the area that I live, we had recently had a tornado come through, which is very strange in the Catskill Mountains for us to have a tornado. That tornado ripped apart the barn and a lot of buildings of a local farm. And the way that that farm was able to recover was through its community relationships. And by being able to bridge together uh, the folks in the community to help kind of respond to these moments of crisis that we have. And I think that that's a really strong expression of the power of community in these types of spaces.
What about the impacts? You talked about resilience. What about the impacts to urban food systems?
Absolutely. So that's the origins of the Giving Grove program started as a means to combat hunger. The we founders of the Giving Grove were packing backpacks to feed people who were experiencing food insecurity, and there was a sense that there needed to be something more, a more perennial food source. And so we're able to really make a large impact on the on these areas that are experiencing food insecurity. Just a couple of numbers from the average orchard that we have is 15 trees. When those trees kind of reach um, their lifespan production, we're talking about 2,300 pounds of annual production potential, about almost 7,000 servings of a third of a pound, and a lifetime production potential of up to 50,000 pounds of food. And again, these is like as I had said earlier, the produce that is coming out of these orchards are coming from holistically managed sites. The varieties that we have are not commercial varieties focused on shipability and shelf life. These varieties are intended to be nutrient dense and to provide communities that don't some of these communities don't have grocery stores within an hour drive, within a half an hour drive. So there's a lot of sovereignty for communities to have these orchards as community assets.
Yeah, that's really, really great. Meg, talk a little bit about your work with the indigenous people. How are you working with them to promote conservation?
Sure. Thanks for letting me share all that. Well, first, I think the preface to my work with local people is the fact that in my lifetime alone, half of the world's primary forests have been cut down or cleared. So the track record's pretty abysmal. And despite great scientific research, research alone doesn't really lead to a solution. I think the bigger solution lies with developing local trust, creating local stewards out of the people who actually live near forests. And too much of our conservation has been top down, meaning we throw money at governments or we expect government officials in a capital city to decree a reserve or a conservation area. And it really doesn't have too much impact because it's so far away from people in fancy offices. And so I've learned now, having been a scientist and done my share of scientific publications, that the best success I've had is building the trust with the local people. And the indigenous people have been in the forest for many, many generations. They respect it, they understand it. And I think if we can help them create a lifestyle that's amenable to them, we can't just go there as Westerners and say, you should stay the way you are. They want schools for their kids. They want, shoes for their children, and they want books and computers. But if we can find a livelihood that allows the trees to stay and them to achieve their own personal goals, it's really great. So I've turned my whole canopy research toolkit into a hopefully an economically sustainable program that I call Mission Green, where we're building the canopy walkways that I used to design for research and turning them over to local people, because ecotourism is a great way for all of us Westerners to give back to trees and sustain forests. It's the coolest thing in the world to go into a treetop with your children and family. I dare say maybe better than Disney World. And it's really exciting because it will provide income to local people. It will provide incentive for conservation, both locally and globally. And best of all, I think it will remind everybody of why we need these trees, because there's a huge opportunity to educate from these structures. So my whole focus now is building on the trust that I've developed over 40 years of rainforest activities with local people in places like Ethiopia and Peru and Malaysia, and then empowering them to be the stewards. We can't just be the bosses back in Washington or wherever we might be. We have to really, I think, empower the local people that live there. And it's a really heartwarming to have all of these talented young people that live in these places become the guides and become the educators and manage their own resources. That's really, I think, in the best interests of all of us. And I say that more as a mom than as a scientist.
What
And I
about the
think if I can just to extend upon what the work Meg is doing with indigenous communities is this idea that like when I started planting our orchard here in the Catskills, this idea that what we're trying to do is reforest a meadow. Um, these concepts are coming from indigenous communities. These precedents have been set long before us. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're taking these long-standing practices and trying to integrate them into our food system. And that's really going to be the way in which we can make an impact on a larger basis. And I think also it's not just taking these techniques, but also the value system that come along with them. Because it's one thing to just do this because, oh, this is going to, give me the best outcome. It's another thing to really deeply understand this process of reciprocity. The Serviceberry book is a really great example of that, of this sort of gift economy in nature. And how do we work towards that that beneficial future is really kind of what we're trying to do by training stewards and by giving them the resources. As you said, it's difficult sometimes to get trees to do what you want them to do, and we need to, like, we can't just kind of expect someone's going to plant a tree and then know how to take care of it, right? So by providing them with the expert guidance and resources, that's what we're here to do with the Giving Grove, and it's just so great to see folks doing stewardship on all different levels across the globe.
You've both started touching a little bit on children, and I want to ask you both, I mean, what are the benefits of the trees, the orchard, the forest directly for our children? Brian?
Oh yeah, I mean, school garden as education is where I really got my start. That was one of the things that's interesting about working with trees is that we have I went from growing vegetables to growing trees, and the lifespan and the timeline that we're talking about is very different when we start working with trees. And in order to make that impact, we need to affect the next generation. Um, those are these changes play out over time, and in order to really make the changes to educate folks, we got to work with school children. And man, when you get a kid into a classroom or up in a tree, that was me as a kid. I was the one who stared out the window, didn't do very well in school. But then you got me into like an outdoor education classroom environment, and that got me. Then I was engaged, and we can really make that impact for a lot of children in these urban environments.
Meg, what about kids? I mean, in the canopy, wherever, what's that doing?
I guess I believe that trees are the absolute inheritance for our kids. So nothing is more important than leaving big native stands of trees as far as our children's health and success later in life. It far supersedes any kind of structures or construction or roads or bank accounts or stock portfolios, because really and truly kids will need these forests to retain their own health when they grow up. So I'm so excited about programs where we can get kids involved. I've been kind of fortunate because a couple of children's books were written about me, and one is required reading for fifth grade science teachers in about 20 states, not my home state of Florida, I must admit, but the teachers find me and they ask me to speak, and the kids are all excited because they've already studied me at school. So I can really be that real life Lorax voice since they associate me with trees. But I think the more we can get kids excited, the better. And kids love climbing trees. It goes together. I've done programs with kids in wheelchairs and kids that are ill and lots of different minority groups, because every kid, I think, deserves to climb a tree, not just perhaps the ones lucky enough to live near a park, which tends to be the wealthier housing in many cities. So I do think it's an incumbent activity for all of us to make sure that we can link kids to trees. It's also been proven that it leads to better grades, better mental health, and more happiness. And I think Indigenous people have taught us that too, that living among nature, not conquering it, is really a wonderful magic for childhood.
Somebody mentioned Disney earlier. I know one of my early experiences in Disneyland was going up that Swiss Family Robinson tree, and obviously totally fake, but just just the way it felt to be up in a tree as a little kid, that stuck with me all those years. And I think in a lot of ways that was the root of me wanting to be a climber, wanting to spend time in the forest. So small
Yeah, and
things
it's
like that happen.
amazing also as well the ways in which children are able to impact their parents and the generation. It's
Absolutely.
hard to get an
Absolutely.
adult to change their practices. When a kid comes home and says like, "Mom and Dad, you're not composting," or "I learned this about the trees today," or "I learned this about palm oil," or whatever it is that they learn, they're able to make impacts on their parents. And that's really a powerful thing, to be able to change the impacts of an older generation is always a super strong thing to see. And we just
I,
recently, with the Giving Grove, we had a seventh grader reach out to us who wants to plant apple trees at her school. And so that's just always like the most exciting thing when you have that desire coming from the next generation.
I think kids are also global more than their parents. That's a great point, Ryan. And when I talk to kids, for example, about the kids in Ethiopia losing all their trees, and I usually also explain to them that I wrote a children's book in Amharic, which is the native language, because if they don't learn about their own forest principles in their own language, how on earth are they expected to know it all? So the kids are so fascinated to think about these kids that live in another country and need something written in their own language. And it's so easy for us in the States to think, well, everybody's read the Lorax because it's in English, but kids all over the world need trees, and kids here can take on a leadership role by starting at home, but local and global are really intertwined, I think, when it comes to forest conservation. And kids get that maybe better than their parents sometimes.
I want to move to the home forest, to our yards. I mean, we've been talking about the orchards, the big forests, and how important those are. But I think a lot of our listeners, they can obviously do something in their yard. What are the pros and cons of planting fruit trees, say, in your backyard, Brian?
I mean, it'd be pretty hard for me to give a con. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty, but whenever I have that conversation with people about that are skeptical about the benefits of trees, that's always a kind of head turning thing. But what I would highlight is the orchard or the backyard as an ecological space. So as Megan said, we are not separate from nature. We do not conquer nature. We are a part of it. We live in this planet, and the way that we take care of that space is the way that we take care of the planet as a whole. And so one of the things I would really highlight is this concept of keystone species and ecoregions. So the United States is mapped out into ecoregions. There's a number for each area of the United States. And associated with each of these ecoregions are species that host beneficial insects, that are hosting butterflies and moths and caterpillars and pollinators and all these things that we need to improve our ecosystem and combat climate change. And so you can plant a pocket forest. You can plant these species in your backyard to give additional spaces for that ecological improvement that we hope to see. That's, if you are feeling despair about the world, starting in your backyard is the most immediate place to start, right? That's kind of our thought with the Giving Grove, is that we'd like to have one of these walkable orchards, or one of these orchards within walking distance of as many people in the United States as possible.
And an apple tree in your backyard, what's that walking distance? I mean, go get an apple, have it for dinner, right?
Right? There's
My,
really just nothing better than that.
you can do both. You can have the big orchards, and you can have some fruit trees or nut trees growing in your yard. I mean, it's a win-win for everybody. I know my last house, which was in the Midwest in Kansas City, Missouri, small urban lot, corner lot, maybe 60 by 150. When I moved into that, it had a 60-foot oak tree in the front yard, which was amazing. I mean, probably a big reason I bought that house. A little two-story traditional square frame house with that gorgeous tree. I planted, I mean, really my goal was to turn that into a forest. In the front yard, I planted a couple of Siberian spruces and a clump birch. And in the back, I put in a golden willow, corkscrew willow, and a cypress tree. So, I'm not trying to do fruit. I'm just trying to do this diversity of shade trees and all that kind of stuff. I planted a pagoda tree between me and my neighbor. Now that proved to be a mistake, because that pagoda tree just grew so fast. I was constantly pruning it back. So eventually took that down, and actually gave the wood to a carpenter to make little gift boxes and things out of it. So beautiful wood on that tree. And the cypress, everything was growing really fast, but the cypress was growing too slow. I mean, I'm watching all these trees, 3, 4 foot a year. Cypress just kind of sitting there. So I dug that up, gave it to my mother, and put a bunch of skyrocket pines along there just to create that privacy between me and the neighbor. That was amazing. By the end of 10 years, when I finally sold that house, you could not see the house from the road. The trees were just so solid in front of it. And the backyard, just this oasis of being out there in the cool air and that comfort. And, it just made me feel so good. And, I talk to you guys and you're going like, yeah, you got to nurse the trees and, all. Really, that wasn't my experience. I dug the hole, I plopped it in there and I walked away. And it just turned into this beautiful environment. So
And
maybe
that
I
might
was
have been
lucky.
creating that kind of forest environment, right? Like I
Uh-huh.
always say, like the forest doesn't need fertilizer, right? You
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
create that
Did its
ecosystem and it takes care of itself.
yeah, did its own thing. So yeah, I'm big, and yeah, next time I buy a house, first thing I'm gonna do is start planting trees, diversity, fruit,
Excellent.
all that. I mean, that's just the way I want to live, and I think that's so easy for our listeners to do too. Um, what about big trees, Meg? Is it possible to plant a big tree in your yard? What does that look like?
Well, that's pretty true. They are expensive, as you know. People who have consciences do move trees when they expand roads or they build shopping centers. There are efforts occasionally made to remove and shift large trees, which is fantastic. And we're just trying to do that in the neighborhood here in Florida, and it costs about $1,000 to buy a big tree and plant it, and that's only 15 feet high. It's certainly not upwards to 60 feet or something like that. So
Oh,
that's
sure.
a difficult issue. And then the other scientific side of this is fast growing trees tend to have softer wood, and those are the ones whose branches are oftentimes shed more easily when it's windy. And so you don't necessarily want people to love fast growing trees because they could be the ones that are messier and the ones that people don't appreciate because they fall on the roof of the house or something like that. So the whole key you mentioned earlier, Bob, was diversity. I think if you can plant with diversity, some of the slow growing, very solid timber trees that will last 100 or 200 years is fabulous. But if you want a little bit quicker shade, you need to have a few of those faster growing trees in the meantime. So it is a beautiful quilt that you end up with. Having a diverse forest is also healthier because that means that the one insect pest on a certain type of tree can't come in and inundate your yard and take all the foliage out in a week, which is what we call a monoculture. When you plant one species of forest or one species of crop, they're much more vulnerable to the enemies, and having a diverse forest protects the trees as well as the owner of the trees.
Yeah, I agree totally. I've got a friend named Mauricio who has 20 acres, so a little bit larger than your normal yard, but not a huge plot. But he's got 20 acres and he's set up what he's calling a wilderness eco village. He's actually partnered with the local university, and they're providing him seeds and starter trees for at-risk species, tree species, indigenous species that are either being crowded out or whatever reason they're dying back. And he's planting those in his 20 acres. And he's calling those his mother trees because the purpose of them
Yeah,
is to reach maturity. And then the university is going to come back and harvest the seeds and spread them to other places.
neat. That's great.
It's very cool. So, even in terms of us as individuals, I feel like our listeners can make an impact. I mean, if you've got a small acreage sitting somewhere, why not harvest or grow something that's endangered, at risk, and harvest those seeds and make a use of them? I mean, besides the indigenous trees, Mauricio has got a dozen Amazonian mahogany trees that he's growing, and they're going to harvest the seeds on this, and he's planning on replanting, reforesting the Amazon once they're gone. So, wonderful ambitions there, and a really, really great project. So,
Neat.
I encourage our listeners to think big. There's so many different levels here of trees in your yard, engaging in that community orchard, protecting our forest, taking a small acreage you own and turning it into a seed bed for forests.
And I think this is where that indigenous value system comes into play. We borrow the future from the generation. I'm just confused myself there, but we need to tend to the future for the next generations. And if we're not thinking about that, and we're just kind of thinking about how we can extract something of value from these forest systems, then we're doing a disservice to the generations to come.
And don't
Future
forget to put a few
generations.
tree houses up once in a while. That's always great.
Absolutely. Have fun, climb those trees. And it's affecting our quality of life too. I mean, thinking of the future generation, but the trees really improve our quality of life here in the present. Meg, you've authored over 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications and have several books out. Life in the Treetops, It's a Jungle Up There. That's a great title. And I think your most recent book is The Argonaut. What are your books about?
So I have written, I guess, 95% of the technical books on the field of canopy biology. If you need to get any expertise or data collection, you can come to my library and I'm happy to share that. But I'm very committed to public science outreach. That's been a huge part of my career as a museum director as well as a teacher. And so I have written books about my own personal adventures in the treetops, my adventures as a single parent, taking my kids to work, which meant they had to get a harness made for them when they were very tiny and climb the tree with me. And what was a disadvantage in my career, I tried to turn into, when you have lemons, make lemonade, make it look like it was really fun. And it was great for my boys and probably great for me in the long term to take my children to work. So I have written along those lines. And then I've written a couple children's books as well. I'm working on a youth version of my Argonaut book right now, and it's also coming out in Spanish next year. It's already out in German and Chinese and a few other languages. I really feel strongly again that we want to save trees for every child and not just our own. So I'm excited to keep trying to work on angles to make trees fun and worthy for every person.
Right, and what kind of resources are available for people who want to start an orchard or just grow some fruit trees in their yard?
Absolutely. So I would first direct people to our website, givinggrove.org. You'll find a wealth of educational resources there. We host monthly workshops, so those are summarized and recorded as well on our website. And then, of course, to tap into your local Giving Grove network program. So if you're interested in planting a tree and becoming a steward, we have 16 cities in our network, and we are growing programs every year. So I would encourage people to look into those resources and to reach out at all if we can help. We're just happy to help people plant trees, take care of them, and do what we can to make this place a greener place.
And that's givinggrove.org.
Givinggrove.org, yes.
Very good. Meg, do you have a website or something people go to?
Sure, thanks. Yes, my foundation, where we're building walkways and donating them to Indigenous people and fostering scholarships for kids to explore the treetops, is called treefoundation.org. It's a run on treefoundation.org, and you can get the free newsletter by signing up, and we keep everyone appraised of new activities in trees, where to find canopy walkways in every country of the world. We're working on a passport, so maybe kids would like to visit multiple walkways and not the same way they like to visit Disneyland and Disney World. So that's exciting. And I have a personal website, canopymeg.com, that highlights all my books and a lot of educational outreach activities that teachers can pick up on and hopefully use to whatever school or Sunday school or needs that they might have, because I think it's really important, again, to link kids and trees. That's the magic.
I want an adult passport because I want to come see all your canopy walkways too.
Goody, I'd love to have you. There's a big global map under treefoundation.org. You can go there and click on it, and you can, double click, and it pops up with the pictures and the stats and the numbers of visitors. It was a really fun project that one of my student interns did, and hopefully you can get to one near your home.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.